This is me. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we'll just keep it kind of low key. I'll just run through a bit of a presentation, and if you've got any questions as we go, just feel free to unmute and ask away. And then at the end, I've sort of allocated 2 hours for this, but you know, we'll just see how it goes. It might be a bit shorter. And you might have a few questions, you might not. So we'll just roll with that. So basically, this is me standing in a field of grass at Mungarara Station, back home in New Zealand. This is a sort of example of a kind of a permaculture system that's taken from Mark Shepard's restoration agriculture, where we have these sort of tree avenues. Some people would kind of call it silver pasture. So every sort of third tree is a nitrogen fixing tree, and the ones in between are sort of fruit trees. So apples and pears and nectarines and bits. And this is just an example of one sort of type of regenerative farming, but it was about sort of that multi-layered type system. And this is this field that I'm standing in. So we used to graze this we had a small mob of dairy cows, about 15 dairy cows that we used to graze through these strips. And this here is about a 4-week recovery. And I just really love this because this pasture is absolutely pumping. And this is a farm that's sort of been following the sort of regenerative type style of management for about 15 years. And it's definitely working for them. Okay, so what is regenerative agriculture? Okay, so I don't know if you're all aware or how much reading you've done or where you're at in terms of understanding regenerative agriculture, but I'll just quickly sort of run through this just to give you an idea. This is kind of where I sort of get my definition from. There's a really good website, regenerativeagriculturedefinition.com, and it sort of outlines, you know, the regenerative agriculture and the levels of it, and you know, you can go quite deep into the understanding of it. A lot of the stuff that we're learning about and teaching and sort of practicing at the moment is very functional. It's sort of that lower level stuff, but it's sort of, you know, some people get quite deep into this, and sort of the ultimate level is that absolute understanding of your piece of land and its capabilities, and just finding that niche for that piece of land. So what is regenerative agriculture? And this is by no means definitive either. So it's a system of farming principles and practices that increase biodiversity, enrich soils, improves watersheds, and enhances ecosystem services. And I think this is quite important moving forward as we transition into the new environmental schemes, the ELMS scheme, for example, you know, where they're talking about those public money for public goods, and it's all about ecosystem function and ecosystem services. So clean water and no flooding, and you know, infiltration and capturing carbon even could be one. And then, yeah, moving on. So it aims to capture carbon in soil and above ground biomass, reversing current global trends of atmospheric accumulation. And this is kind of like for me, I think this is still quite a secondary thing, because it's almost like a byproduct of a good regenerative system. And it's very complex as well. I know there's people that are measuring carbon in their soils at the moment, and that's great, but it's still very much, you know, it's still very much a misunderstood thing, because you can have carbon in your soil and it might not necessarily be functional carbon. It might be kind of dormant carbon. So this is, yeah, I think this will be a challenge moving forward, definitely, understanding carbon. And I think, like, even when Nicole Masters was talking about it, she was saying carbon's like water. It's very, very hard to pin down. And another good one is, you know, climate is changing. So it offers resilience to climate instability and higher health and vitality for farming and ranching communities. So it's about making your farm more resilient, and that's market resilience, climate resilience. There's massive fluctuations in the weather, as we've seen. We've had a really, really wet winter, really dry spring, and then it looks like it's dry again now. And this is kind of, I listened to Darren Doherty. He came to our farm in New Zealand and he did a talk there, and he basically said, you know, the world's being Australified. He's an Australian, and it's essentially, you know, this is why the regen ag movement is quite strong in Australia and New Zealand now. New Zealand's just had a massive drought as well. And it's sort of offering you that resilience. And I think because the climate in the UK is reasonably stable, okay, we get, you know, a bit of dry here and a bit of wet there, but it compared to like South Africa and Australia and parts of America, it is quite stable. And also, so it draws from decades of scientific and applied research, from like organic and agroecology and permaculture, holistic management, agroforestry. There's a lot of this, everything that we're sort of putting into place within a regenerative system is, it draws from all these different faculties really, and sort of brings them together, and sort of overarching is what is considered regenerative. And I think, to me, you know, regenerative agriculture is all about repairing, and so that your farming system is improved year on year, and that's, instead of sort of depleting your soils, you're building your soils. And so, yeah, I always say it's kind of like healing the land. So I'm taking on a project down in Cornwall, which is a arable farm, intensive arable farm, and the soils there are pretty much devoid of life. So I see, by putting regenerative principles into place, I can actually re-engage that soil and improve that and heal that land. So that's kind of how I see regenerative agriculture. How do we achieve this? So it's the 5 principles. Minimal soil disturbance, min-till, no-till, direct drilling, pasture cropping. It's all about keeping that network in the soil. And there's tillage is very, very damaging. Tillage is probably the biggest issue in agriculture, particularly in the UK. The more you till your soil, the more damage you're actually doing to that soil. You're destroying the structure, you're destroying that habitat. Because if you imagine the soil is a home for microbiology, and they've, you know, they spend a long time creating these really, really intricate networks and relationships. So things like mycorrhizal fungi, and also even just the structure between the soil as well, which for air and water, and keeping this little avenues for the biology. So the more tillage you're doing, the more damage you're doing to that soil. Keep the soil covered. So keeping the soil covered, not only are you feeding the sort of the soil biology from above, which is not so important now that once you understand where the carbon's actually coming from, but it's also keeping that armor. So by covering the soil, when you get, say, a big rain event, by having that carpet there, it captures that, it absorbs the energy of the rain and stops that damage to the soil structure, which is a big thing in the UK. And you'll see it, if you've got bare soil and you get a heavy rain event, you'll see a crust form quite quickly on that soil. If that was covered with some plant material, then that wouldn't happen. And it's also about keeping the moisture in the ground. And you'll see this now. I know a lot of people are cutting hay at the moment. So if you go and go into your hay meadow after it's just been cut and everything's been removed, and you'll stand on it, it's very hot and dry. Whereas if you went somewhere, if you had just a little bit of hay left lying on the ground, you'll see underneath that it's still quite moist and a little bit cooler. And it's about sort of protecting the ground and the biology. Maintain a living root. I've just read a really good book called The Soil Owner's Handbook by John Steaker. And he basically says the most important thing is in the system is feeding the soil energy, maintaining a living root. And that is maintaining the green, so maintaining photosynthesis, because carbon is captured through photosynthesis, first and foremost. The quickest way to heal your land, the quickest way to pump carbon into your soils is through photosynthesis. And that in turn feeds the soil biology. So the whole idea is that there's this intricate relationship between the plants and the biology in the soil. Photosynthesis can put up to 60% of the energy or the exudates that come in through photosynthesis. So the carbon dioxide and sunshine creates this flow of exudates, which feeds the soil biology, which in turn they bring the minerals to the plant. And this is very, very critical when you turn to a no input regenerative system. So it's about maintaining green and maintaining photosynthesis. And that's why grazing management is so critical in this, because once the plant goes to seed, it's basically transitioning its energy into the seed head rather than into the soil to feed the soil. And you'll see that, you'll see fields could pretty much go dormant, and the biology will go dormant because they're not being fed that energy through the exudates that are coming through from photosynthesis. Diversity, diversity, diversity. You want as much diversity in there as possible. So each plant will do certain things in terms of animal health, in terms of growing cycles, in terms of root architecture. So you have a really complex root architecture, different pore space in the soil. And so when you're putting your cover crops in, so I'm putting a 30-way cover crop in after this harvest. And then the idea is that each plant has a role to play. So the more diversity you can get in there, the more resilience you can build. And that's why a really super diverse, natural, native, permanent pasture is, to me, is the ultimate, because it is diverse. It's super, super diverse. And each plant is there for a reason, because nature's put it there for a reason. Incorporating livestock. So it increases the rate of decomposition. It feeds the soil. But there's a really intricate relationship between the animal, grassland, and soil. So over time, our grasslands have evolved to have ruminants grazing them, and that's how soil was built. Now, if you look to the Great Plains of America, which is kind of where this sort of idea came from, that the way that soil is built through photosynthesis, the grassland will maintain photosynthesis through grazing. And by incorporating the livestock, you're working with a really complex microbiology within the ruminant animal, because it's got such complex digestive systems. And then when they shit it out into the soil, you can actually see that that's creating that microbiology. And you can see it in your field. Like, a lot of people will think that it's just the nutrients coming through from the animal, but it's actually, if you go into a field which has got you'll see dung patches that are really deep green color. If you peel that grass away, you'll see the fungal networks developing in that, and it's quite a cool thing. Whereas if there's no livestock in that system, you do not have that biology being added to the system. So the grazing side of things, so the whole thing, it's all about this whole system. You know, what you do in one place affects the farm as a whole. And you can play around with this. So say you've got certain areas that are low nutrients, that are low in nutrients, you can manage this by your grazing. I was looking at a farm today, and you know, it was very obvious that there was quite a nutrient rich area up on the top of the field where sheep had camped under the trees. And you can play around with moving those nutrients down by playing around with the grazing, and look into using all your classes of animals. So things like leader-follower systems, and understanding that different animal classes require different quality of feed, and different species have a different place. So you could potentially, you know, run your lambs through and then follow with your cows on a rotational system. But it's just about understanding that what you do in one place in your farm affects somewhere else. And I think that ultimate level of regenerative agriculture is realizing this, that you really truly understand every single field on your farm. It's important to remain dynamic. It's not a prescribed method. And it's individual to each land parcel. It's also individual to each person. So it's about playing around, it's about experimentation, it's about trials, it's about working out what's best for your farm, really. And it varies with weather, obviously, varies with seasonality. And that's why they call it adaptive multi-paddock grazing, because you have to be adaptive. If the weather changes, weather pattern changes, so say we're in a dry spell, you might want to extend your grazing period, and then as soon as it starts raining, you want to speed it up again. So you've got to be quite dynamic. You've got to be very adaptive, and it's about finding the niche of your farm. What does the land do well naturally? And it's, you know, the ultimate understanding of your land. Work to your strengths, work to your farm strengths, work to your staffing strengths. Work to your knowledge strengths, what's already in place, what infrastructure do you have in place. You know, make it simple. There's no point in creating complexity when you don't need to. Whether there's markets there that are easily to be exploited. Yeah, it's about finding the strength of the system. I call it mindful farming. So, you know, you're mindful of your everyday actions. So and observation is crucial as well. And it's about enhancing ecosystem function. And that's where you start to read about grassland function and soil function. And that's where you really get to understand the importance of grazing management. So it's about working as close to nature as possible. So instead of ripping up your permanent pastures and planting down a multi-species cover crop, it's about maximizing the permanent pasture performance, because over time you'll get more out of that than you will out of trying to fight against nature. Incorporating your hedgerows, your tree grazing, work with the existing natural capital. Now, what's there already? How can you put that into your system? You know, cattle were browsers before they were grazers. They love trees. Objectives, you know, and this is about your grazing management. What do you want to achieve during your grazing period? You know, do you want to encourage growth? Do you want to improve your fungal networks? Do you want to build covers? You might be stockpiling feed for deferred grazing. It's about the objectives at that time, and it changes all the time. So it's, you know, again, you've got to be adaptive and dynamic. So yeah, so it's been proven to show that this type of grazing, it can build your soil carbon levels and soil microbiology function. I know it can, because I've seen it. And they're proving it all the time now. Enhance water infiltration and retention. And I think this is really important here in the UK. Like there's a massive infiltration issue in the UK. We're just, you know, our soils are almost hydrophobic. You'll see this later on in the year when everyone's out harvesting their maize. There is no water infiltration. It's good to see that the government have suggested that soil health can help mitigate floods. And I hope that they can sort of move on with that as well, because I think as farmers, in terms of public goods for public money for public goods, water infiltration and flood mitigation is critical. It builds soil fertility, it creates nutrient-dense food, it improves ecosystem biodiversity, it controls erosion, better soil structure obviously, creates better erosion control, and enhances wildlife diversity, nutrition, and habitat, and it improves livestock production and economic returns. And I know now that at the moment people are like, oh, you know, how much is it going to cost me to go down this route? And the way that I manage my farm is that I go on a low cost system. So it's all about removing costs and working as closely with nature as possible. And that's where you get your economic returns, because you, instead of being focused on production, you're focusing on minimizing costs. But also, you know, production is there because you can grow healthy animals at a very, very good rate, which I've done as well. So some concepts. All wealth comes from the sun. Land is a solar panel. The grasses that grow dictate the efficiency of the solar panel. So if you understand that your pastures are all little solar panels, so the leaves on the grasses are all little solar panels. So if you can have a lot of green biomass and big leaves, then you're going to harness a lot more energy. And that's why, you know, you want to keep your covers quite high, but you don't want to take them down too low. Energy is the elusive part of the equation when trying to achieve animal performance and health. A lot of farmers out there think it's protein that we should be going for, but it's actually energy. Energy keeps the rumen functioning and it keeps the animal growing. When you sort of focus on energy rather than protein, I mean, protein's there in grasses. Most grass is probably too high in protein. But once you start to understand about energy, that's when you start to see gains in your animal performance. The closer you work with nature, the higher the chances are of succeeding. You know, nature's been doing this for a long time. So when we look to nature and understand nature and understand the cues that we can get from nature and enhance nature, that's when we get our systems cranking. Eat the plants in a vegetative state. So obviously this can vary a little bit, but it's essentially what you try and do is you're trying to keep the grass in a green state, because when it's in a green state, it's pumping energy into the soil and it's feeding the soil biology, which in turn feeds the plant. Once that energy transfer changes from going into the ground and then into their seed head, and then it goes dormant, and that feeding of the biology stops. So this is really crucial. And I know there was some confusion around Graham Hand's workshop where this, you know, letting it go long and then doing big impact grazing. I would suggest for the UK system that it is very important to maintain green. And because we have a very long growing season, I would imagine that, you know, especially down here in Cornwall, we could grow grass all year round. And it's very important that we keep the grass being fed through it. It's basically a self-fulfilling system, because as it's growing, it's essentially pumping energy into the soil. So as I touched on before, diversity of plants creates stability and resilience. So we want to have resilient farming systems. We don't want to have no rain for 6 weeks and then all freak out because it's a drought. It's about creating a resilient system. Feed the soil from above and below. So essentially, the way that soil biology gets its carbon or gets its energy from, first and foremost is photosynthesis. Second to that is the leaf matter, plant material that's dropped on top of the soil. Third, if they don't get those things, then they'll start eating the soil, essentially. And that's pretty much where we're at now, is that because we're not maintaining this photosynthesis, we're chewing the pastures out too much, taking it too low. There's not enough energy in the system for the biology, and we're pumping nitrogen into the system, which speeds up the biology, which creates this crazy cycle of burning carbon. So in this sort of system, you know, carbon is more important than nitrogen. Nitrogen is fixed in the soil, either through legumes or even through soil microbiology. So if you look to nature, in a natural system, you know, and especially in a grassland, the nitrogen comes from the biology in the soil. I don't know if anyone's sort of read any Elaine Ingham stuff. This should be quite apparent for you, but basically it's about this bacterial fungal ratio. So if you imagine a heavily tilled, sort of nitrogen heavy arable field, would be sort of 100% bacterial and very simplistic bacterial, whereas a conifer plantation would be 100% fungal dominance. And what you're trying to do in your grassland is maintain a ratio of 1-to-1, essentially, or around about there. So if you've got too much nitrogen in your system, it'll be very bacterial dominated. If you've got too much carbon in the system, it'll be quite fungal dominated. And so what you want to do is play around to try, so you can feed more carbon into the soil to increase your fungal dominance, or you can introduce more nitrogen to the soil. And it's interesting in the UK because you've got these extremes. You'll have these sort of fields that aren't really grazed that heavily or intensively, and they tend to go a bit dormant because they've got a lot of carbon and non-functional carbon as well, of basically the plant going to seed and then falling down and decaying. But because there's not enough nitrogen in the system, that plant matter isn't decaying very rapidly. Or then the opposite is you've got too much nitrogen in the system and it's burning up all your carbon. So it's about finding a balance between these two. And then stop sending money to town. So essentially you're trying to create a low input, low cost system that works as closely to nature as possible. And then you make your gains through increasing your stocking density, because the healthier your land will be better. You'll get better growth rates from your grassland, and then you can increase the stocking density. Sorry, can everyone just make sure that their microphones are muted? It's just a little off-putting. So we've got the liquid carbon pathway. This kind of came from Christine Jones, an Australian soil ecologist. Photosynthesis feeds the soil. And this is an example taken from an arable farmer who puts a lot of energy into his cover crops. And you can see the sort of, it's called rhizosheaths. And that's the soil biology has sort of connecting to the root hairs, and that's where the interaction between the soil and the root hairs takes place, and that's that transfer of energy and nutrients, and it's very, very obvious in this situation. So this is an annual, and they tend to put down exudates quite quickly. So the energy comes from above and the minerals come from below. And then if you sort of expand this out into a permanent system where you've got the fungal networks as well, it extends the networks of the root hairs and then creates a far more sort of expanded network that can do that exchange. So it's about re-establishing that relationship between the plant and the soil. So at the moment, with a lot of sort of conventional systems is that we feed soluble fertilizers on top, and it breaks that link between the soil biology and the plant, because the plant, it just doesn't need that networking basically. So it's about re-establishing that network, and getting that that colonization of the rhizosphere. Okay, so understanding grasslands. Avoid eating more than half of the plant. So if you have a look at this picture here, where I've got the red dotted lines, if you can maintain your grazing at that level, then you'll maintain that root structure basically. And the lower down the plant you eat, as the plant gets more stressed out and it has to find the energy, because it can't get the energy from photosynthesis anymore because those little solar panels have been taken away, what it does is it drops its roots into the soil to get the energy to then regrow. So this is why it's really important to do that. Avoid eating more than half of the plant, because if you can keep the plant in that sort of mode where it's not dropping any roots, then it'll be far, far more productive. And it's also about minimizing the plant stress. And you'll see that if you've got a heavily grazed, usually from sheep, where they take it quite tight, as soon as that plant gets stressed, it'll go to seed. And you see this with ryegrass all the time. So it'll just instantly go to seed because it's under stress and it wants to reproduce. So you're trying to minimize plant stress to keep it functioning so it's nice and relaxed and it just keeps doing its thing. And that is why we want to avoid eating down more than half the plant. Animals will always seek energy first. So you'll see them when you let the animals into a field, they'll go around, they'll walk the boundary, and then they'll pick out the best parts of the pasture. And that tends to be in that top sort of 25% of the grass. And then once I've taken that sort of first bite, they'll go around. If there's sufficient amount of grass in that field, they'll sit down and they'll ruminate. And then you know that everything's all perfect. If there's not enough in that, they will go around again and again and again until they get their fill. But as they go further and further down the plant, they're getting less and less quality and higher protein, and they're also getting down into where the parasites hang out, and so like increased worm burden and things like that become a bit of an issue. So it's about achieving that balance between energy intake and protein intake. And the thing with most grasses and clovers and things, you know, they are quite high in protein anyway. So that's why I think that energy is definitely key. Now a lot of you guys would probably have seen this and know this, this little infographic. This is the importance of rotational grazing. So if you understand that when you mob your animals up, I mean, naturally animals were in a mob anyway. So in nature, cattle were mobs. They're massive mobs that went through on this massive migration. And so this is what we're trying to achieve, is trying to replicate that. If you leave a cow or a sheep in a field, set stocked for a while, basically what they'll do is they'll go around, they'll pick out the best bits. And then they'll go around, if they've got a choice, then they'll pick out the best bits again and again and again and again until you get this mosaic of sort of long grass and short grass. And what will happen over time is those choice bits of grass, which are often the highest quality feed or highest minerals, they will get eaten down until they run out of energy because they can't photosynthesize. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to increase the competition between the animals so that when they go into a pasture, they're not thinking about the choicest parts. They're just going around and going, oh, you know, I'm in a group, I'm going to eat the best bits in terms of energy. So they'll take the tops off, and then hopefully if you've allocated enough, that's where they'll stop. And then you move them, and by moving them on, they're not going back and taking that second bite. And that's the issue. If you allow that second bite, then that plant is basically sending out its sweetest shoots full of energy, because that's its next growing phase. If the animal is still in there, it will go back and it will eat that because it's the choicest piece of grass. And it also, mobbing the animals up increases the energy capture. So it maximizes the photosynthesis of your farm, because you're keeping the animals in one space, which allows the rest of the farm to recover. It's allowing the plant basically to perform naturally, and it's all about that grazing, then rest. So the plant is designed to be grazed once, moved on, and then when it's ready to be grazed again, you come back to it. So recovery, rotation design, it's essentially all about plant recovery. And so once you understand plant recovery, I think this is critical. So during high growth, you speed up and you slow down during times of low growth. And that's how you set your rotation design. So during, if you're overwintering your animals, you'd probably set a rotation at about, I don't know, 120 or 150 days. But as soon as spring hits, as soon as that ground gets to about 8 degrees, then you start to speed up, because the transition from a slow growing to a fast growing will be very rapid. And the same as with summertime. So you'll have now, if it's been very dry in some areas, you slow your rotation right down. And then if there's rain, you speed it right up again, because you know that as soon as you get moisture, the grass is going to absolutely fly. So it's about understanding, and that's quite a fun infographic which sort of shows it, but it's about understanding plant recovery periods. And once you understand that, it makes your rotation design far simpler. And use your animals as an indicator to balance utilization. So you'll understand if you've over allocated or if you've under allocated. And I always think that it's better to take less and come back than take more, because if you take less, you've got that option of returning to a paddock. Whereas if you take too much, then you don't have that option. So when do you graze? When is the best time? When has that plant recovered sufficiently to be grazed? So if you have a look at this little picture here, the period between that really slow growth and that rapid growth is pretty much the same. So if you can maintain that, and that's where you can maintain that root structure by not taking the plant lower than half, and then that is like the optimum time to harvest that grass. It's just before it changes its energy balance between feeding the soil and then transitioning to setting a flower. And so once you kind of get to that's a very fast growth stage, and if you can maintain it, it's critical. But understanding when that point is, you have to understand the plants and where their recovery sits, and it's different for different plant species. So you can so if you've got a heavy ryegrass field, and you don't really want ryegrass, what you can do is you can let it go beyond. So let that ryegrass go to seed, which it will if it's dry, and then ignore it, and then allow the base to come up, because what that ryegrass has essentially done is sent all its energy into its head, and then it's run out of energy, so it's gone dormant, so it gives a chance for less competitive grasses to come through. And that's a really good way to sort of increase the diversity of your fields if it's a bit ryegrass dominant, which I imagine if you've got conventional fields, they probably will be. And yeah, so it's based on plant recovery, speed up during high growth, slow down during low growth. So this is back at Mungarar in New Zealand. This is still green, this is still photosynthesizing. There's a little bit of stem in there. It's probably about 25% flowering. And I'd say, you know, that's maybe just pushed it a little bit far, but you know, those cows, they're R1 heifers and they're absolutely blooming. A little bit of stem is good because it sort of keeps the rumen function going. You don't want it to be too lush and too green because it'll be too high in protein. And if they're taking too much off, then it will just go straight through them. So don't be afraid to let it go too mature, but it's not, you do not want it to go past the flowering stage essentially, because then the energy transfer happens. And monitoring is key, and then using your animals as an indicator. Be dynamic and don't be afraid to experiment. What you can do to understand your plant recovery is you get like a marker stick and go out there sort of every week on a Friday and just mark it on a stick, and then you'll see, as you know, as season on season builds, you'll understand your own grasses and your own grass species and the performance of your farm, and you'll be able to create your own recovery periods. This is some pig ground that we had where we rotationally grazed some Berkshire pigs, and here it's all fescue and it's just gone away. It's very the soil here is pretty poor because obviously the pigs have destroyed it. So you can use your animals as tools. So here's 300 R2 heifers, 400 kilo heifers, and I put them through this, what was it, like 0.8 of a hectare. So they were getting 0.1 of a hectare on the hour, every hour for 8 hours. And what you do, I think I've got a picture here. Yeah, so basically, this is using them as a tool for other functions. So I'm trying to get on top of the grass, but also create that mat and sort of get some quality back into that system. And that's what 300 animals on 0.1 of a hectare looks like. And I let them in, graze for about 40 minutes, and then they'd sit down and they'd ruminate for a bit, and then as soon as they started standing up again, I'd let them into the next block. And I did that through, I think it was 8 blocks, and then I let them back into their normal field as a reward. But you can see by their behavior when they're done, that was a really, really good example, because basically they'd go in, they'd gorge themselves on all the best bits, and then they'd kind of trample around and create this mat. And then they would all just sit down because they were full, and then they'd ruminate. And then you could just see them popping up. You're like, okay, now it's time to move. So look to your animals in terms of indicators. And it works for sheep as well. So this is where I'm here at the moment at Crocodile Farm. These are sort of native breeds mixture, and you know, we've got lambs. I mean, it works. It definitely works. Some of these lambs here were March born, and we got some away the other day, and they're over 50 kilos. Like, they're absolute monsters, but they're absolutely humming because they're just getting the choice of bits. Essentially, the size of your field multiplied by the recovery period divided by the whole area to be grazed. And if you're within sort of, you know, stocking, sort of average stocking densities, then this
Is anyone else losing Tim?
Yes. Yes, I am.
Yeah, he seems to have frozen. Let me just send him a message.
I lost it as well.
Should be that recovery period.
Ooh.
And then if
Tim,
we
you cut out there. I think you might need to go back a page and start on that one again.
okay, sorry. Internet down here is terrible. Okay, so yeah, I don't know how much you got, but basically this is the, I'll go right back. So this is the magic ratio from Mitchell Innes. Size of field multiplied by the recovery period. And this is why understanding that recovery period is critical, and then divided by the whole area to be grazed. And as I said, if you're within sort of government guidelines in terms of stocking densities, then this should be fine. So again, you know, simple maths, 5 acre field, 30-day recovery. I just said, so late spring maybe, and then divided by 100 acres. And then that will give you 1.5 days in that field, which you could then break down into sort of 3 12-hour breaks if you wanted to get a bit creative. And then, so then we can play around with this. So if you're a bit more into the scientific grazing, like from the dairy industry in New Zealand, which is kind of where I started, you can use your dry matter requirements. So, you know, same size fields. So say you're running 70 livestock units over your 100 acres or 40 hectares. For example, 90 400 kilo steers, so, or close to 500 ewes. So a mob weight of 36,000 kilos. Their feed requirement, roughly 2.8% body weight. That's 1,000 kilos of dry matter per day for that mob. So say your entry cover is 3,000 kilos, exit covers 2. So you're taking away 800 kilos of dry matter. And that's where you get that sort of that third from. Eat a third, leave a third, and trample a third. So it does work if you're within sort of that, those guidelines. If you're overstocked, it won't work because you're overstocked. If you're understocked, what will happen is that your fields will get away. But what you can do then is you can put those fields out of the grazing platform and say, okay, so they get to a point, they've gone too far, they've gone to flower, let them go. And that can be either cut for hay, deferred grazing, or wildflower meadow, or, you know, just left for bees and butterflies and birds. And you'll see if you follow these principles, you will get more grass. And essentially, like in a year's time, a third of your farm will probably be tied up for hay meadows or wildlife or something. So when it gets a little bit complicated, because obviously not every field is the same. So then you add a rating. So you get your size of your field multiplied by the rating, multiplied by the recovery period, then divided by the whole area to be grazed. So, sorry. So that rating, you know, it could be like 80%, or 50% if it's a poorly functioning field. And then you just multiply it out, and then that gives you a more sort of accurate figure, which relates to your farm. So then in terms of monitoring, you know, I always look to my animals in terms of an indicator. Animal behavior, you know, when you get your grazing right. So yeah, I was out at a farm today, and we've been playing around with their grazing management, and you can just see when you've got it right, the animal should not be like absolutely galloping to the next break. They should be kind of slightly begrudgingly going to the next break, because they're not excessively hungry. Another way is looking, if you're using electric fences, is you look under the wire, and you can see if they're trying to eat under the wire, then they've been there for too long. And it's quite obvious if they're overgrazing. And also, you know, if you've got shiny, happy animals, and these are Wagyu cows, which aren't really designed for a grass system. in New Zealand, but they are looking absolutely stunning. And you can just see by the sheen on their coat that, you know, they're really, really happy. And you're looking for energy as well, and you can see it. You can see when an animal's depressed and its ears down and it's not happy. And your animal health as well. You know, if you're getting a lot of lameness, mastitis, things like that, then probably you're feeding them too much protein. If you're getting foot issues, definitely too much protein. Looking at their dung, so you don't want it to be too wet, but then you don't want it to be too dry either. So if it's too wet, obviously they're getting too much protein, and it also can be that there's not enough oxygen in their rumens. But then if you've got that really kind of looks like horse poo, then they've got too much fiber in their system. Growth rates, you know, I'm a livestock farmer, so I get paid on live weight gain. That's what I'm trying to achieve, really. And when you get this, we played around. We had immaturists come out to the farm, and we were playing around with grazing, and we were getting upwards over 2 kilos a day on our Angus heifers, finishing heifers on grass. Some of them were doing 2.5 kilos a day. It's absolutely ridiculous, but they're absolutely flying because they're super healthy, they're super happy, and they're only eating the best. And also, you know, when they're eating like that, they don't actually need as much feed either because they're getting their nutrients. And also, obviously, fertility, so cow fertility, conception rates, calving. Another fun way to check the balance between energy and protein in the rumen is a urine pH test. So just take a bit of litmus paper out, wait for a cow to have a wee, and then go and put your litmus paper in it, and it will indicate if you're around that sort of 6.5 to 7.5, then you know the rumen's in balance. If there's too much energy in the system, you get acidosis. If you've got too much protein, you get alkalosis or something like that, the opposite basically. And that's where you get acidosis, and sort of if you're feeding a hefty grain diet to your animals. Soil health monitoring. So I do a lot of work with Abby, with Sector Mentor, Soil Mentor now, which is a really, really fantastic tool for farmer-led soil health monitoring. You know, once you understand the really crucial metrics, it's a really fantastic tool. So, you know, in the middle, although that's not the right protocol, but basically that is a slake test. So it demonstrates how strong your soil structure is, how good that glue is at holding your soil together. And this was taken, we had a demonstration day at the farm, and I dug up some soil on the lawn of the lodge where we were doing the demonstration, and then this is from the paddock up the farm. I put a lump of soil in off the lawn, and it dissolved in about 15 minutes. And this lump of soil, we had it for about, I know, early into the evening, it was still held together like that. And that is the critical thing, you know, with the whole slaking test, because that is erosion, that is flood mitigation. When you see all the soil pouring out of gateways in November and December, it's because the structure is completely destroyed. So if we can maintain our soils like that, then, you know, that is fantastic. And your VES scoring, you know, your visual assessments, whether it's crumbly, whether it's blocky, you know, these are things as farmers that we can look at just by digging a hole in the ground and understanding the functionality of the soil. Infiltration rate's a really good one as well, because it shows you sort of the porosity of your soils. And then there's bricks as well, which is a little bit complex, but essentially it shows you the photosynthetic activity of your grasses. So if you can get brixing above sort of 15, the plant health of that, the health of that grass is really good. So it won't get attacked by pests and disease, and same with your animals. If your animals are eating grass that is brixing above sort of 15, I think.
Lost them again.
He's just had new internet put in as well.
I think Nicole was saying it. Am I back?
You just cut out again, Tim.
That's all right. I was just going to say, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. Good. How was that? Questions? Fire away, please. Please, we've got an hour to kill. So yeah, if you've got any questions, queries, you want to do
Allow presentation.
any troubleshooting? No questions?
I would have a question.
Yeah.
I have very old pasture, pretty worn out by too many sheep for too many years and nothing put back in. And the grass varieties are very patchy. I tend to believe that if I leave it, it will adjust to what would be natural there. So I'm not quite sure how to improve really the eating on it.
It depends. Are the sheep still on it?
I strip graze with goats. I have some sheep, but not many. And I have a horse. So I mean, eventually I will maybe get 2 cows. I only have 25 acres for everything I want to do. Mm-hmm. It's quite steep, but I try to do the mob system really, but I might leave them on there too long. I might do it a bit faster now.
Yeah, I mean, if you're taking it too far, then you're limiting the energy going into the soil. If it's an old permanent pasture and it hasn't really been grazed very well over the years, what can happen is that if that's been set stocked in the past, is that the animals, possibly sheep, they will just continually graze a patch, and then it will get to a point where it no longer can sort of photosynthesize effectively, and it will run out of energy, and then the soil will go dormant. And the way to get around that is just to lift your covers. So do take less, but move them more frequently. So you're trying to sort of increase the size of the grass so that you can get more energy into the system. But it's
okay.
Yeah. I mean, I've never really I don't know I don't know anyone who does mob stocking with goats, unfortunately.
Well, it's the same as sheep, really. I mean, if they have to eat, they eat what they're presented with. Otherwise, they, like cows, would wander around and pick the nicest bits.
Yeah.
The other question would be subsoiling and springtime harrows. Is that permitted, or is that a big no-no like ploughing?
I mean, subsoiling, it depends. Nicole Master says if you subsoil, then feed the biology. So you can subsoil and then put like a dribble down of vermicast sort of juice, worm juice. So and molasses, so that you're putting energy into the soil as you go. So you're creating like a channel of biology. And you got to be careful with subsoiling. Essentially, if you can get your pasture, increase the biomass of your pasture, then over time that will increase the structure of the soil, which would sort of eliminate the need for mechanical intervention. Really, it depends. I would would tend away from mechanical intervention, because the way I understand it is that if it's a permanent pasture, then there's quite a lot of intricate networks going on if it hasn't been tilled for a long time. So then to put rippers through, you would definitely be damaging that soil biology. But if it's a sort of, if it's been ploughed within sort of the last few years, then it's probably not too bad. But it's that balance really. Yeah, if you can encourage sort of, I don't know, is it a permanent pasture you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would shy away from that, to be honest.
Okay.
And the tine harrow, what the spring tine harrow does, it's good in the spring to break up that thatch. If there's not enough nitrogen in the system, you'll get a buildup of sort of that sort of thatchy grass. That's hard to break down. And what you're doing by running a spring tine over that is you're putting oxygen into the system to sort of reactivate that biology. So it's not such a bad thing, because all it's doing is really giving it a tickle up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's more the heavy tillage. So inversion ploughing, and then just breaking that down. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Tim, I've got a question about planning for deferred grazing. So you mentioned it a little bit in terms of when covers are going to seed, and you can then leave it and defer. But if you're planning for deferred grazing, particularly somewhere fairly chilly without year-round growth, like you have in lovely sunny Cornwall, have you got any advice or guidance on that?
Well, I've seen deferred grazing. So in New Zealand, we did a lot of this because we outwintered everything, obviously. And I've seen deferred grazing that's 6 months old, basically. And it's still got that quality in the base. What you can do is you can have a higher quality, so maybe a high quality hay or something that you can add to the mix as well. So it's not all just long lignified grass. So if you can balance it out, and also balancing between high quality fields, and then they maybe come out and graze for an hour in a sort of a more lusher pasture. But yeah, I imagine you guys are up in Scotland, yeah. It's what happens basically, that the grass will get to a point and it'll lignify, but there should be enough quality in the base. And if it's just cows are fantastic for that as well. And I prioritize your young stock and give them the better quality feed, and then just put the cows on the deferred grazing.
That's great, thank you.
If your cows, if the dung is too runny, does that mean you're grazing it too tight then? They're getting too much protein?
It depends on the grass, at what point the grass is in its growth stage. If it's got too much, what happens is when it's too high in protein, it goes into the sort of the intestines for digestion rather than in the rumen, because there's not enough roughage. Also, if it's too sort of leafy and there's not enough stem in it, there's not enough roughage for it to hold in the rumen as well. So it's a secondary sort of digestion route, and that's what tends to happen with high protein feeds. So if they are, what you can do is just introduce a bit of hay to the mix, which is essentially stemmy grass. So that's why I don't think you should be afraid, especially for older animals, to go for more stemmy, so a sort of higher stem to leaf ratio, because I've seen it also in the past where I've fed young stock and I've thought, they're absolutely going to fly on this because it's this beautiful, rich, lush pasture. But actually, it was just too lush for them, and it just goes straight through them, and all those gains are lost basically. But also it could be a lack of oxygen in the system, and I think there was, I think Ian said something about putting baking soda down, bicarbonate of soda down, and it neutralizes it a little bit, and that might help as well.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I've noticed that cocksfoot, it seems to me that most times in the year when they find cocksfoot, they eat it right down to the ground in preference to other stuff. They seem to really go for cocksfoot. Do you find that?
Yeah, cocksfoot's a really good grass if you can control it. You don't, the newer varieties, like if it's a sort of a sown down variety, then it's better than the older varieties. The only problem is you got to be careful that it doesn't go clumpy. So it has to be managed appropriately. But I would always put cocksfoot and Timothy and fescue in a mix before I'd put ryegrass in it. In fact, I wouldn't put ryegrass in a mix anymore, knowing what I know. So yeah, cocksfoot's a really good one, especially for cattle. And again, you know, cows will love cocksfoot as well, because it's amazing what cows will eat, really.
So do you recommend overseeding with fescue and things like that to get winter grazing?
Into permanent pasture?
Yeah.
I mean, essentially the seed bank's there. If it's a native pasture, then the seed's there, and it's about managing for those plants, and they will come over time. It's because the problem is when you overseed, because the pasture is quite competitive anyway, you probably wouldn't get a great sort of strike going into a permanent pasture system. I've played around with it before, and now I just think working with the natural system, working with what's there and improving the management of permanent pastures, you can get a lot more gain out of, rather than trying to introduce stuff that may not take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we seem to have a lot of creeping bent, which isn't particularly productive, I would say. So we're trying to move away from that. Yeah,
I think that would be a management thing. So if you've got a lot, I would try and sort of, because we've got a lot over down here on this farm I'm taking on nearby as well. And if you can probably sort of mob up and then trample it to get it to control, to try and encourage more diverse species to come through. But I imagine it's a condition of the soil, the climate, you know, what we're going through, because just because something is there this year, it may not be here next year, especially in permanent pastures. I've seen masses and masses of clover, and then 6 weeks later it's completely different grass. So I think as the management changes over time, those grass species will change.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah, you?
There's a guy called Jim or Jamie Elizondo. I don't know if you've come across him in America, but he seems to subscribe to a different approach, which is you basically graze it pretty tight. And he says if you don't graze all of it, then they're only going to graze it selectively. But I guess you wouldn't agree with that, would you?
No, I've seen it with my own eyes. They basically go into a field, they'll take the tops off. It's almost like someone's run over it with a mower. When you get it right, cows, they'll go across, you know, if you can it's about getting that competitive of the mob so that they're not thinking too much about selective grazing. And that's all about the mob pressure, basically. If they're doing selective grazing, then they're not in a tight enough group, basically.
Right.
And because it sort of changes throughout the year, because as your soil health improves, the palatability of your grasses improve, and then they get less selective as well. The problem with that, going in and rinsing everything to try and create a non-selective situation, is that you are just stressing out the plant. So you're not really working with the function of the plant, you know. So you want the animals to just go in and they just take that first bite, and they'll go in, they won't think about it, and they will look for energy rather than, you know, specialist plants. And that's, I do not, so I wouldn't really take my covers below, in a growing season, I wouldn't take my covers below 2000.
Right.
Coming out of winter, you know, if it's a tight winter, this is outwintering, you know, 800 animals. You sort of come out winter around the 1800 mark, and it's fine to take it down a bit during a non-growing period, because you're not stressing the plant out because it's not growing essentially. And then in the spring it will do that, drop its roots to get the energy to grow again. And you can clean up your fields that way as well by taking them down. But yeah, nowadays I'd probably go in at 3.5. Like my perfect situation would be to go in at 3.5 and come out at 2.5, maybe even higher. When Ian Mitchell-Ennis came to New Zealand, he was even advocating just taking 20% of the plant off, 25% of the plant off. And that's, you know, where I'm standing here, that's kind of what we're playing around with. And that's when you really get that sort of greenness and that bulk from that greenness. I just think by taking it back too far, because these guys are dealing with single growing seasons, and that's sort of coming out of Australia and America, and I think that's where the confusion is. Because when he was here on this farm, he was saying that has got a lot of people in a lot of sticky situations, because what you're doing is you're extending your growing season. So the plant's putting all its energy basically into the head, and then you're hitting it too hard, and then it just doesn't have the energy to come back. Whereas if you do a system like this, you can, I've seen plants come back, you know, within sort of 12, 24 hours, because that function is still there. They're still happy. They're still, you know, they're not stressed out. And to me, I think that's crucial, and to keep that photosynthesis going, which then feeds the soil. Yeah.
So if you're doing it like that, you go in at 3.5 and you come out at 2.5. How many times a year on a good pasture would you be able to do that, do you think? 6 times, something.
Well, the rotation changes. So in the early spring, I'd probably look, if it's all about that plant recovery, you know, sometimes like on this farm here in New Zealand, the soil is absolutely pumping. It's beautiful. You know, we're getting growth rates of 100, 120 kilos a day, easy, maybe even up to 150 kilos. And so you'd be returning as quickly as the plant recovers, really. And sometimes that's 18 days, sometimes that's 30 days, sometimes that's 100 days. And so you don't get sort of tied up in these long recovery periods. Once you understand the critical point at which to graze in terms of the actual recovery of that plant, then, you know, it could be very different for very different farms, you know, different grasses, different climates and things like that. So yeah, you could be doing, I used to set my rotations every month. So on this farm here, I ran, it was about 5 or 6 different mobs. And so I had 5 or 6 different rotations on the farm all happening at once. So every sort of 4 weeks, I would do a rotation plan for the coming 4 weeks. And that was based on that recovery period for that month. And it can change overnight. So, you know, if it was really dry, then you knock it back to 120 days. But that's your recovery period. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will take 120 days before you come back to that field. But at that moment in time, that is the recovery period. So that is how you set your rotation. Whereas next week, it might piss down with rain over the weekend, then your recovery period is now 40 days, because that's essentially how long it would take that plant to be ready, because you've just got all that moisture coming into the system. So then on Monday, I would change my rotation again to reflect what's happening. So, and that's why you have to be really dynamic. And I think that's why if you use that ratio and kind of concentrate on the recovery of your pasture, I think that's critical in terms of setting your rotation designs.
And you use a plate meter, or are you doing it all by eye, or some combination?
The plate meters came out in New Zealand for a ryegrass clover dairy farm. You know, we were looking at some grass today, and they had one of those sword sticks, and I said it's 2,500 kilos of dry matter in here. and we got the sword stick out, and it says, you know, and by the time you balance it out, it could be this, could be that, but you know, as long as you understand that if it's around your ankle bone, I think ankle bone, or if you've got a boot like this, that's about 2,500 kilos. If you've got a New Zealand red band, what we call gum boots, which is like a mid-calf welly, that's about 3,500. So if you go in, and if you've got big Argyle boots, are they? If you go 3/4 of the way up there, you're probably up towards the high 3,000. I would go halfway up my calf and then out. I think they used to say, and at the knees, out at the feet, and that was for cows. So yeah.
Yeah.
And I think with these really diverse, especially with permanent pastures, plate meters just don't work. And it's about getting your eye in. And in reality, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter as long as you're never eating more than half the plant. And then you can quite quickly see how much your animals are eating, and then you work it out from your animals essentially.
Yeah.
Because I've been there. I grew up on I started out working on a dairy farm when I left uni many years ago, and it was all about plate meters and feed budgeting and feed wedges and all that sort of jazz. But you know, it's once you get to this point, and if you use that ratio, I think it's a little bit different with a commercial dairy herd, because obviously it's not as a natural system, so it's a little bit more challenging. But that's why I prefer suckler herds.
I would have another question about trampling. If they all run to their new patch and walk around a lot, they don't eat the trampled stuff. What happens there? Is that good or bad?
Oh, that's good. Well, if they're running to their new patch, then you're not feeding them enough in the first patch. They should just casually walk to the next patch. But if they're trampling, so the whole point of the trampling is to create that mat, that above ground sort of carpet, as it were, to keep the moisture in, to keep the soil nice and cool. But yeah, trampling's very important, and that's where they got that whole third. You know, these eat a third, leave a third, and trample a third, because it's not wasting grass. You're essentially feeding the soil, and we've sort of been exploiting the soil for a long time and not really giving anything back. But this is about feeding the soil and actually understanding that the soil, the livestock within the soil is just as important as the livestock on top of the soil. So you're never wasting anything because it's always there in the system.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, do not be worried about trampling grass. It's a good thing.
Good, thank you.
Should one aim to let some of the farm go to seed every year to sort of pasture regeneration?
I mean, the seed bank's always there. Seed bank's in the ground. The plants will come as the soil conditions, as you know, because plants are all about succession. You know, certain plants suit certain conditions, and everything's in a succession. So you'll have certain grasses. So clover, for example, is an early succession. It's setting down about a foundation of nitrogen, so that the biology is there, so that another grass species will fill that role. I think as you improve the conditions for that particular plant, those plants will come. But there's no harm in letting things go to seed. I did see the other day, I think at the Farm Ed Centre, they were taking some wildflower seeds off their pastures with a fun little thing behind an ATV. And I think that, you know, there's no harm in doing that. But essentially, there's an inherent seed bank there in your soil, and that, you know, that will come essentially.
Right. Do you expect to use wormers, or do you expect animals to kind of develop natural, you know, combination resistance and culling to sort out parasites?
I wouldn't use wormers, just because it blows the, you know, the biology of the cow's biology out. It's a hard one. If you've got control of the animals from the start, from day dot, I would go for worm tolerance over worm resistance, because worms, for some reason, they are part of the natural system. Not sure why, but they are. So some form of you know, worm tolerance is far better than worm resistance, because if they're naive to worms, then they're obviously going to get infection. But if you manage your pastures so that you're only really taking off the tops and not eating down into the base, then there should be no worm pressure. And you can also balance your animals so that, you know, you could change between the sheep and cows. Older cows, worm, it shouldn't be an issue. I've had animals in the past that have come in really, really rough and full of worms and stuff, and just by increasing the health of the animals by feeding them, you know, a good diverse pasture and high energy grasses, and also things like chicory and plantain and sainfoin, and these condensed tannin plants are really good as well. But you can also, so on the farm here, because we buy and sell older ewes, we use garlic. So we make up a garlic and molasses drench and drench them with that, and it seems to do the trick. I think, you know, a lot of the time with parasites, and it happens with plants all the time, the reason why they're being attacked is because there's some weakness there. So if you can overcome that weakness, then they'll develop a natural immunity.
Tim, just to add to that, something that I thought was really interesting, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about these sort of unintended benefits of moving your livestock frequently and having to kind of shift water, and you quite often emptying water and putting in clean water can really reduce fluke risk as well. And it wasn't something I'd really thought about, you know, really thought about the parasite risk zone. So, you know, grazing taller covers so that you keep their noses up, and the long rest period, meaning that there's less risk of parasites still being viable. But I hadn't even thought about that kind of clean water, fresh water every time you're putting them in a new paddock, which is a really interesting thing to think about as well. Yeah,
flukes are a funny one, because it's quite, if you've got sort of damp, sort of muddy fields, marshy sort of things, you know, there's obviously going to be an impact from fluke there that you have to manage and be careful of and be wary of. It's just about understanding your land and understanding the farm as well.
Okay.
Good. Any more? We can finish early if you want. Go out and enjoy the last of the sunshine. Oh, if there's no sunshine, is there sunshine in Scotland?
How long does it take?
A little bit.
Tim, how long does it take to transition? Is it like a never-ending process to go from a set stock system to a regenerative system, or do you think you see, if you go at it, you see big benefits in a year or 3 years or 5 years? Or
I think once you start, if you go from a set stocking regime to a rotational regime, you'll see it within sort of a few months. You'll just see the change in the grass. If you know, this farm that I'm doing down here in Cornwall I'm picking, you know, 5 years to get the soil functioning, but this is going from like a complete dead soil that's full of soluble fertilizers to a fully natural, no input system. But I think from a grassland perspective, you'll see gains you know, within 1 or 2 rotations, you'll definitely see gains.
Mm.
And even on this farm in New Zealand, you know, the guys that own this have been farming this way for 15 years, but they're only really starting to understand how to graze their pastures appropriately, because it was still very much, when I came into the situation, it was that sort of tall grass grazing, you know, high utilization, and that was that kind of, because that it's sort of, because the grazing, the understanding of the grazing has kind of come from the Savory Institute, or out of Australia or out of America. It's a very different sort of system, a different style, and it's got people in a lot of trouble by letting their pastures go for too long. So, you know, even on this farm where my boss is a huge advocate of regenerative agriculture, until you actually fully understand how that plant functions. And I think it's taking it a bit, you know, a step further to actually really apply practical knowledge and scientific knowledge. And because though, you know, a lot of this information is very fresh, very new, probably only realized in the last sort of 5 years, because of the power of the microscope has given that ability to understand that really intricate relationship between the plant and the soil, and the absolute importance of photosynthesis. So, you know, and we were lucky to have people like Christine Jones, Nicole Masters, Ian Mitchell-Innes, Darren Doherty, all these people come to this farm and have these workshops here. And so we were able to actually get all that information and apply it. And it, once you sort of understand it and see it in practice, it just sort of clicks into place.
Mm. But we've got ground near here. I mean, I'm in Somerset, West Somerset, which hasn't been grazed for like a year, or it gets cut once a year, and it grows 3 foot tall, you know, well over your knees. It's fairly green. It's got a seed head on top, but you know, come May time, it's green with a seed head, I would say. I mean, that's still not ideal. You do better to graze that several times a year rather than just do it once a year. Would you get a better?
Totally. And if you understand, so that recovery period is probably 12 weeks to get it to that stage. So you could graze it up to that point, and then 12 weeks before you want to cut it for hay, let it go. And you'll get all that grazing ahead of that, so that productivity. Because it's like when you mow your lawns. If you mow your lawns, the more often you mow your lawns, the more often they'll come back. And it's the same with grazing. You know, you run so in the spring, to get things pumping, I would do a whole farm rotation just to kickstart that grass, because there's also an intricate relationship between the ruminant animal and grass as well. So, you know, in the saliva of the cows, there'll be certain like potassium salts or enzymes that encourage tillering, and you know, that's designed. Grassland and ruminants are designed to be together. And yes, you know, because you're cutting it and taking it away, then essentially you're kind of acting like a ruminant, but you don't get that diversity of biology. And yeah, so you could easily graze it up to a point and then just let it go, and it'll be far more productive.
Right. Well, thanks very much.
Good.
Thank you.
Really helpful. Really interesting.
Cool. Yeah, and just feel free to drop me an email. If I mean, everyone's quite aware of my email on the PFLA forum probably now. So just flick me a message, and if you've got any more questions, I'll be happy to help out.
And sorry, last question. You think so live weight gains of like over 1 kilo or even 2 kilos are perfectly achievable? Are they on this system in England, in Britain?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the UK is all about pasture. You know, it's a perfect pasture growing environment. It's mild, it's wet, it's got a bit of sunshine. You know, this is essentially all the pastures in New Zealand came from the UK. And it's just that because New Zealand lost the subsidies, they went down the route of understanding grassland because it's the cheapest way of feeding your animals. And
Yeah.
when you know, everything in New Zealand is pasture based, apart from a few dodgy dairy farmers that like a bit of palm kernel. But you know, we milk off grass. We've got one of the most efficient dairy industries in the world because it's all grass based. We don't really feed animals. And this farm here in New Zealand, we were finishing sort of 4 heifers a week all year round, and that's through winter and everything. So we, you know, it's all about live weight gain. So definitely, and yeah.
And you'd be finishing them at what, 20 months or something, would you, before their second year, before they reach 2 years?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah.
So around 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, amazing. If we could all do that, that would be amazing.
Cool. Good. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Brilliant.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.